Well, hello everyone. Thanks for having me. My name is Paolo Gabriel, and I'm a senior computer vision engineer at LookDeep Health. And today I'm here to talk about our recently published work on continuous patient monitoring. This is a different way of thinking about hospital care, unlike my other colleagues who are talking about these specific types of treatments or therapies. We're looking at the whole patient journey while they're staying at the hospital. But before that, a little bit about myself. My name is Paulo Gabriel. I have a website that's a digital garden, so you can learn more about me through that. But what I want to share with you is that I was born in the Philippines. I grew up in Japan, and now I live in Oakland, California with my partner and our two cats. Um, I received my PhD in electrical engineering at UC San Diego. I focused on medical devices and systems at the Translational Neuroengineering Lab. My academic work was all about bridging the gap between engineering and clinical applications. And a pillar of that was me using the Kinect, both V1 and V2, and mounting it on a cart, bringing it into the epilepsy unit so that we could watch patients who were having seizures and record from their brain and record video of them moving. That was sort of the motivation for me to get into computer vision in healthcare. But since 2019, I joined this company called LookDeep Health, where we are scaling our own computer vision platform using these much smaller devices to try to get video into the hospital so that we can monitor every patient at every moment. It's really about bridging that gap and looking at the long-term impact of what this can do that I'm focusing on. So we recently published a paper on our platform. It's been running for almost 3 years now. And we recently, and we described the system and our validation process and our key findings in this paper. You can scan the QR code for open access. And for the rest of the agenda, sorry, one second. I will first be diving into our technical approach for continuous patient monitoring. A huge part of that is the computer vision development loop that's required to make this all happen and work at scale. For our transparency, I want to share the key lessons that we've learned from deploying this in the real world. And towards the end, we'll have time for discussion and Q&A. But before we move forward, I just want to reemphasize this point that this talk is about a simple computer vision system that's been robustly applied at scale and evaluated. I won't be talking about state-of-the-art methods, as I'll reveal soon. So let's talk about the need for patient monitoring. Imagine you're a patient staying in the hospital. You're in a safe place and you're surrounded by staff and you're receiving appropriate clinical care. And at the same time, you're mostly alone and no one is really checking in on you. Unless you're risk at seizures or at fall, where they can bring in a video card or a sitter, the resources to monitor you regularly and at a high frequency are not really there. So most of the time you're alone and unattended. Your status is checked on a schedule. And there's a button in the room maybe that you can use to call for help, but it's hard to find. We found that both patients and staff, from their perspective, simple information is useful. Even things like, at this point in time, where's the patient? What state are they in? Is there a staff nearby? We can also try to extend that, I think, in the future to more diagnostic things, but those are out of the scope of this talk right now. We really wanted to challenge ourselves to use simple computer vision first, bounding boxes, classification, those bread and butter, to try to get into the hospital and build up faith that having these monitoring systems are useful. So we want to apply novel ML, and that's in our future. But for now, I'm talking about demonstrating the basics. So why use computer vision for patient monitoring? As I mentioned, direct observation is very limited and annotation is time consuming. Take it from me, I was annotating videos before Deep Lab Cut and before CVAT were in the game. So I had to use MATLAB and build my own point and clicker, and that took forever. So using computer vision, you can analyze and annotate long periods of video very quickly. There's existing work about this already, mostly as a means to an end to study things like correlations between brain activity and movement, or for example. But what we're talking about here is a baseline architecture and a systematic review of the performance of a more simple computer vision system, one that runs on the edge on a device that has an RKNN NPU unit. We're processing RGB at 1 frame per second. Our computer vision core consists of YOLO v4 object detection and the Gunnar-Farmbach dense optical flow method to estimate scene motion. And so what's really unique about this work is not the methods applied clearly, but the 3 years of recording across 11 hospital systems that we've done. This is a much larger scale of work than what I was doing back in my grad school days, where I was excited to publish on three patients, collect 10 subjects overall for my thesis. But here we're benchmarking our AI-driven patient monitoring and providing data-driven insights into the behavior and interactions of the patient while they're in the hospital. So now I'm going to frame this more as a computer vision problem. So the goal is to directly observe patients in the noisy clinical environment. Ideally, you want this nice, clean setup. Here it's simulated, but the camera is, it's mounted in a fixed position, and the patient and their bed are centered in the view. You have clean and nice lighting. You can see everything. There's nothing else that's unnecessary in the room. But in the reality, when you're out in the hospital, you get wild things. This is a chair next to a bed, but the chair looks like a bed. This camera was placed at a really odd skew. We have nighttime and daytime performance. Our camera switches into an IR mode when the lighting gets too low so we can see better at nighttime. But those images are distinct from if you just grayscale a daytime image. But despite this, we built and validated a computer vision platform that really works in these hospital settings. I want to show more examples of what this wild is. So here's some more images from our domain. They're from actual deployment. They're blurred for privacy here, but you can see like in the center, there is a nice clean view, but the surrounding views show examples of different view angles, heights, lighting conditions, occlusions by blankets, staff, visitors. The visual variance is what our models need to be robust to. And the reason why I bring this up is that generalization isn't just a desirable feature. It's a fundamental requirement for the system to function. So how do we do this monitoring? Well, it starts with a recording unit that's placed in the patient's room. Here in the cartoon, it's two things, but right now we have a single device. A video feed is processed and sends near real time. A video feed is processed and sends this data into our edge compute, which then runs in real time to deliver data along with the video feed to the clinicians. Along the way, there is some cloud data pipelines that are run to calculate broader insights. And so this really is a hybrid system that runs on both the edge and the cloud. But I'll be focusing on our edge component, which runs our computer vision pipeline on an image, detects objects, does classification on the people, estimates motion across the scene. And then we also run our own custom algorithms to determine things like, is the patient alone, were their boundaries crossed, et cetera. And then those are the outputs that are then served to the rest of our system. So what does this data look like? Here's an example of our real-time pipeline. You'll see that we have a rich structured data set here that includes object detection, masks, motion. Here you can see just the magnitude. And notably, we also track state changes, like I said, with our algorithms. This allows us to analyze patient behavior at the minute level, at multiple granularities, starting from the frame level up to the minute level, and even aggregating to higher orders like hour. So here, one of the things that we really tried to drive home is let's focus on a simple feature like when is the patient alone? What times are the patient alone? And we ran that through our manuscript. So here's an example of course, to train and evaluate a supervised learning system, you need ground truth. And this is where our data engine comes in. Here's an example of a labeled frame. For a given frame, our human annotators provide bounding boxes, class labels, and additional metadata tags about the given image. At the time of publication, we had about 40,000 frames, which you can see a snippet of it from our data lake view using 51. Critically, we don't just label the objects and things in the scene. We also add metadata tags for whether the image is bad or if an object is occluded or truncated. These are really essential for curating and training our test sets and for debugging model failures. So labeling isn't a one and done activity. It's a core part of our ongoing MLOps loop. The way we use our labels is right now, our system is currently processing over 30,000 hours of video a month, and we're scaling up to over 100,000. From that, we're periodically sampling our frames and blurring them. And then we're feeding those into 51 to sort of manage the rest of the data management portion. We use this tool to visualize and curate our data sets and find errors, but more importantly, we use it to prepare and send out our images for labeling. The tool that we use for labeling is CVAT. We have an in-house labeling team that we have a long history with, that we've established like really good criteria on what we want. And so we give them those labels through CVAT. They're fully blurred. They know what to do. We then take these labels and use them not only to train, but to also evaluate our model and models over time. Notably, we hold out every fourth week of data collection as a test set. And so this growing test set allows us to evaluate old versus new models. Since thanks to our model governance, we're also able to run our old models against this new data. So let's look, how well does it perform? We wanted to start with the fundamentals. And so here's a look at object detection and classification for a single frame. Here's an example of a single model versus the ground truth. But of course, over time, we had other models that we wanted to run. Because we had like simple metrics like mean average precision and F1 score, we were able to do these side-by-side comparisons of our models over time, as well as against like a baseline architecture like off-the-shelf YOLO. We also use our metadata tags, like I mentioned, to look at the differences in performance during this daytime mode and nighttime mode. And so these can be summarized in a snapshot of here was our current model performance versus baseline. And you can look at it for these different metrics. Like we perform pretty well in object detection for people, classifying the role, and also for classifying if they are alone at this individual frame level. I think this high performance is essential, as any errors in these fundamental tasks tend to propagate downstream in further analyses. Another point, I just want to reiterate this point about retraining models with more data. As I showed in this graph, we continued to train our model over time, and that was possible because our test set and our training set just continued to grow with our labeling process. One thing we noticed, as I mentioned, is the drop in V3 in its performance at night. And so not only did we continue to increase our training volume size, we were also making more targeted data collection, shifting the time when we were collecting to bring these ratios of, on or day or night closer to what we were seeing actually in the wild. So far we've been talking about frame level analyses and these fundamentals. And while they're important, they don't have any additional context about their neighbors. And when you're monitoring a video feed, you have this continuous stream of images. And so what I think is really more valuable is like the time series view, analyzing trends over time. That's what has more clinical impact. And so we ran this labeling campaign where we had these videos that we then gave to our labelers, and they just bookmarked when periods were happening. Like the patient was alone, they were receiving care, they were eating, so on and so forth. And that was a pretty expensive one-off labeling campaign, but it did allow us to evaluate the consistency of our signal over time rather than just on a per frame basis. And we also found that doing so allowed us to separate the logic algorithms that we had for like smoothing or for aggregation, separate that from evaluating the core models themselves. The note though is that you need to have video, you need to have these like longer clips of time, and that may not be possible to record. It's a little hard to do in a system. But with this, we were able to focus in on trends, and the trend that I'm presenting here is the patient alone. It's basically for the hour, how many minutes was the patient alone is what we were looking at. And we compared them to our ground truth, and we found that from our labeled data, we could also identify which patients had the most typical, like which ground truth sample was most representative and which ground truth samples were the most outlier. So here's an example of a typical patient where you can also see the AI inference in red is pretty tight. It's pretty accurate to the prediction of time spent alone. But we also have an atypical patient. This is the least unlike. You can see that they were not alone a lot at night. And unfortunately, our object detection at the time was not very good. And so we were misrepresenting that alone prediction. I would say in accuracy, maybe the top one is close to 0.9, and the atypical patient is closer to like 0.6. But you don't just need to do that for one patient, you can do that across all your patients. So here's the score we calculated for these 10 patients in our V3 model for accuracy of predicting these time alone segments. I would say 0.8 is pretty high. It's definitely not random. And that gave us some confidence that our pipeline was producing some pretty cool data. So that's the manuscript. You can read more about the details in the actual paper, but the summary that I presented includes talking about our AI-driven monitoring system, how we ran for 3 years, the methods and evaluation that we did for training of both our frame level computer vision, as well as our developing our aggregation algorithms for trends. They're all there. And there's also a link to a public data set of these hourly trends that we've released. The paper links to a project page from which you can explore the data or just pull it directly. It's out there for anyone to explore. So the next thing I wanted to share was some key lessons that we learned about, I think, that are broadly applicable to anyone deploying computer vision in the real world. Here is a timeline of sort of the data that we had and presented in the manuscript. Around over 3 years, starting from when we released our first model in 2022. And the only consistent thing here that you can see is our frame labeled data collection process. The rate at which we trained and released our new models was really tightly, we approached it each time with a new pair of eyes. We had some one-off labeling campaigns, but they weren't sustainable. And then the public data set that we released is pretty fresh compared to the rest, but it's also just a small portion of the overall like evolving timeline of data that we've been collecting. And so what I take away from this is more data over time is a very good thing. But the thing that has allowed us to sort of have our bearings as we navigate this course is to have a consistent test set. At the time when we published, we had about 10,000 images, and we've grown that since. And then having that tight integration loop for being able to monitor your model drifting over time, being able to decide when to train, and then have expectations for how long you evaluate it and let it go on. Those are really important systematic processes that function that you need at scale that you don't always see in the research lab where you're just trying to get that next model out. Another thing building off of that is not just time points, but the metadata was really helpful for us. It allowed us to audit our data and understand what is there. And not to say that we can control anything, but it allowed us to more anticipate our biases. So like when you go and check out this data set that we released, you will know that it's mostly from large hospitals that see more than 150 patients a day, that it's typically skewed toward it's a non-uniform distribution of gender and age, and that different hospitals and different patients have different lengths of their journey. We don't intervene, we're non-interventional at this point, but this is just, I think it's important to know, especially if you have these assumptions that the hospital is uniform and all behavior is consistent, which is definitely not true, especially for humans, right? The second lesson that I want to share is just talking about the generalization. I noted that there's a slight difference in the type of data that we use for training. So the same time point is represented by 3 different types of images. When it's run through an edge pipeline, we use an unblurred image, but when we're presenting to the labelers, it's fully blurred to protect patient privacy. And then we find a compromise in our training data where we blur the face, but we keep the rest of the image unblurred so that we have more of the spatial resolution preserved. And we found that the training data and the live unblurred data being slightly different does result in our model performances being a little favored towards the face blurred images. But that difference is marginal and we continue to monitor it. And so that's how we convinced ourselves that it's okay to have this slight nuanced difference in the data. Similarly, with the camera on and off, you need night vision when it's dark. And so shifting to collect more of those types of samples to improve performance in that domain was another sort of decision that we looked at and we decided to do without really quantifying. Uh, and I think part of that was we already had found success in the variation of the camera placements that we had. Like the images that I showed before, this maps to this heat map here, where our cameras are mostly centered, but not always. And when they are centered, they're usually take up a quarter of the scene, and they're usually vertical, but not always. And even then, what we found, I think this is the most interesting part, is that downstream, when you aggregate further and further, like here, when we're looking at just time periods when the patient is alone and moving or supervised by staff, when you take those predictions and you swap out just the alone prediction with the labels that we had, the difference in the trends only comes down to about 1 to 2 minutes per hour. So yes, there is variation. Yes, there's going to be effect, but it wasn't deal breaking for us. And I think that's a really powerful lesson that we learned. And then finally, I just want to give a huge shout out to all the open source tools out there. You really don't have to build everything from scratch anymore. Like I said, my MATLAB days of point and click horror are over. Thanks to tools like 51 and CVAT, where we can explore and curate these image data sets, been super powerful. Earlier, I also showed an animated GIF from Rerun, which allows you to to view the streams from our cameras. Here's a view where we have 20 up at the same time. It's really cool to see it live. We've also explored custom tools like gaming engines to try to render our own synthetic data. But now we can generate these really cool videos, but they're never labeled. So I still have this wish that I'm going to put out there that I wish I could generate synthetic data that came fully labeled with bounding boxes, segmentation, depth, and motion. And I think there was a world where using gaming engines could do that, but just look at it. And then the thing I want to acknowledge is that all of this is really built on top of a super solid backbone of we are on Google Cloud Platform. That's where we store our data. That's where we manage our system. And so having that solid core has allowed us to really explore these different tools. And also our AI team is of 3 people. So we're at this size where we really can afford to be super flexible and try out many things. But even then, the tools here that I show are what we come back to time and time again, because just how good they are. So as a summary, I've talked about our system and how we apply computer vision to monitor many patients across almost a dozen hospitals for a long period of time. We've released an open access to our data sets, and I've shed some lessons about the importance of tagging, expecting imperfect conditions, and using tools that are out there already, especially the free and open source ones. The last thing I want to note is that when we published the manuscript, we were on our version 5 of our model, and we just continue to keep getting better using the same rigorous standards that I've laid out already. This work was a massive team effort. Before I end, I want to sincerely thank my co-authors, my incredible colleagues at LookDeep Health, both past and present, the reviewers for the journal, as well as my personal friend reviewers that I made, connections that I made through graduate school. Thank you so much for helping me improve the manuscript. A quick shout out to ChatGPT for helping refine and improve the clarity of the text as well. But most importantly, I want to thank our study participants. This is just a snippet, paraphrasing of our acknowledgement, but really their contributions are the foundation of this work. So thank you very much for participating. We wouldn't be here without them. And with that, my talk is over. Thank you so much for your time and attention, and I'd be happy to help and take any questions.
Fantastic, illuminating. Thank you very much. Let's grab a few questions because we do want to get to Osbod's talk. The first question came in right before you started talking about frame level, so early in the presentation.
Mhm.
Are you blurring the image at the time of recording on the RK chip?
We are blurring it at the time of capture, but after we have run the inference on it. So that way the pipeline, the computer vision gets the unblurred image, but then what we store is blurred.
The next question came right before you started talking about your model development overview. And the question is, what classes can the classifier discriminate? Do you also have some sort of action recognition?
So right now, in the time of the paper, we did this really clever thing where we just used YOLO 4 and we assigned three different person classes. So it was detecting patients, staff, and others specifically. And then we just sort of like repack that back into person detection with multiple classes. Nowadays, we like using co-attention-net as like a secondary way to reinforce it. So you can just have a simple, a non-transformer or transformer-based classifier do that as well. But really, we did not do any action recognition because our 1 frame per second like requirement is pretty tight, and those models tend to be larger and have longer execution times. So maybe that's something we can use in the cloud, but those real-time constraints really limit what we can apply on the edge.
Fantastic. And Ron had a couple of questions, but we'll take one. How many metadata points are used in the training process?
How many metadata points? We don't use any of the actual data during the training process itself, but during curation, we have exclusion criteria. I think everyone should do as does during experiments, right? Like you don't want bad frames, you don't want frames that don't have like that are pointed towards the wall, for example, if there's a corruption. We don't have a specific number, but we do have a rubric, and they're all tagged in 51, so you can sort of pick and choose, or our team can pick and choose how we want to pull our data.